while simultaneously not disrupting the space-time continuum. You cannot come in contact with your past self. It can have catastrophic consequences.
Finally figured out how to make my low-calorie maple syrup.
Wait! No! Dude, what are you doing?
What? Who?
Were you messing with the time machine again?
Oh, man. Did I put the wrong date again? How do they seem to get it so perfectly in the movies? I don't get it.
Did you not hear him talk about the whole space-time continuum thingy?
You're not looking so good.
Great. Now I'm disappearing.
That can't be good. Oh, pancakes. Can't leave any macro behind.
Alright, I'm going to show you how to make your very own homemade, low-calorie, no added sugar maple syrup. Very simple, easy to make, easy ingredients, and I'm going to show you how to do that today. So we're going to start off by adding 460 milliliters of water. And we're going to put that jar aside because we will be putting our syrup in here for later. So the next thing that we're going to add is some Himalayan salt. Salt just enhances flavors that you're going to be adding in there. Now when it comes to sweeteners, you do have your options and what you want to sweeten it with, but there is a difference between the sweeteners. I've used Splenda, which is sweetened with sucralose before. It is much sweeter than the other one that I have, which is an erythritol monk fruit sweetener, and there are calories in this one. Unlike this one here, which has 0 calories because it's sweetened with erythritol and doesn't get absorbed into your bloodstream. So I like using this one, but you do have to use a little bit more. So we're going to use about 44 grams of our erythritol monk fruit sweetener. If you were to use the Splenda, you'd have to use probably about half that amount. So just to add more flavor and sweetness, we're going to add about a teaspoon, again mixing my vanilla cream sweet drops and regular sweet drops. So again, it's going to work out to about half to 1 teaspoon of these sweet drops. Next up, we're going to add 1 teaspoon of, this is artificial vanilla extract, but you can use real extract. This one is pretty low calorie, so the real one has more calories. So to keep the calories down, still gives you that flavoring of vanilla, we're going to use 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Last up for extracts is we're going to use some maple extract. We're going to use 2 teaspoons. So if you want more of like that maple flavor, I wouldn't put too much more. It can get a little bit bitter if you start overdoing the extract. So 2 teaspoons is a good amount, and I wouldn't exceed more than 2.5 teaspoons. All right, so I'm just going to whisk this all together. Again, you'll start to see probably some bubbles form. The bubbles are okay. It's just what happens with the mixing process, but we want to make sure that the salt and the sweetener dissolves when we are mixing it. So you'll see that even though it does get kind of bubbly and foamy, before I add in my last ingredient, you'll see that they'll just start to pop and go away. So you can kind of wait for them to kind of settle a bit before we add in our last ingredient. In my small bowl, I'm going to be adding our final ingredient, which is going to help us to get that thicker consistency. And that is some xanthan gum. So we're going to use some xanthan gum, just about 2 grams. Now the xanthan gum will make some of that foamy bubbles stay, but we can get rid of that if we strain it through kind of like a strainer before we pour it into our bottle, which I'll show you in a bit. But we're going to add about 2 grams of our xanthan gum. And I do like to add the xanthan gum in while I'm mixing, just so that I'm not adding it in right away, because it will kind of clump up and we don't want the clumps. So we're going to try to minimize that as much as possible. So while I'm stirring, I'm just going to slowly kind of sprinkle in the xanthan gum and continue to stir until I get a nice thick syrupy type of consistency, because right now it's obviously very watery. So I usually like to wait before the bubbles kind of go away. If you mix it while the bubbles are forming and it starts to thicken up, because the more that you add air into the mixture, obviously the thicker your mixture is going to get. So we are obviously seeing that. You can see the xanthan gum is starting to clump up, but we'll get rid of those once we continue to stir. So as you continue to stir it and activate the xanthan gum, the thicker it's going to get. But again, the downside is you might get some of those bubbles that will form. If you put it through a strainer, you'll be fine afterwards. So you can see and you know that your mixture and your syrup is getting thicker because the bubbles are not popping as easily because they're getting trapped in the thicker mixture. That's how you know that you have a thicker mixture. Again, if you just continue to stir it, you'll obviously get a thicker mixture, but you are going to get more bubbles. So that's just kind of something that's going to happen. But at this point, you can feel free if you want to taste it and see where it's at. If you need it sweeter, you can add in more sweetener if you like. Just kind of let that rest a bit just so that the bubbles kind of settle and hopefully pop a little bit more before we put it into our jar. See you in a bit once these bubbles kind of settle a little bit more. All right, so you can see that our syrup has a lot still of these residue bubbles that I'm just kind of going with a soft silicone spatula to try and pop as many as I can as I'm kind of stirring it through. While that's kind of settling a little bit more, we are going to be pouring our syrup into our bottle. But before we do, to make things a little bit easier, we're going to make a funnel. This way it makes it a little bit neater. So just take an old water bottle and just cut off the top part here. And you can recycle that. And now, when it comes time for pouring, you just simply take the top part of your water bottle and now you have created a funnel. So very simple. So this way you can make it nice and neat when you're pouring it into either a jar or another bottle that might have a smaller opening. If you have one of these mesh strainers, it just makes things a little bit easier, and it'll also help to filter out some of these bubbles that we have left over with our syrup. And then you can take your soft spatula and just kind of press it through as well. You can also take kind of like a butter knife and just kind of stir it around, and that will also help to pop a lot of the bubbles that are in there as well. All right, here we go. We've made our low-calorie syrup. We're going to store that in the fridge. It doesn't need to be stored in there for very long, but as you do, you'll start to see the bubbles kind of settle to the top, and then you can either just kind of scoop them out and you'll be left with your syrup, or you can just give it a shake if the bubbles are not that big of a deal for you, because you're still getting all of the flavoring and low calorie. This entire jar, which weighs about 520 grams, is about 8 calories. For the entire jar, you're not going to be using that much syrup. Per serving, which is about 60 grams, is like 1 calorie. Very low calorie, tastes amazing. And now I'm going to show you how to make the chocolate syrup, which I also use, and I usually combine the two on my pancakes or French toast. And I'll put a little bit of the maple syrup, I'll put a little bit of the chocolate syrup, and they both taste amazing, and they're both low calorie. All right, so I'm going to show you how to make your very own chocolate peanut butter syrup. And a little bit different than in my other video where I show you the blender version, this is just going to be kind of whisking it together. So very similar ingredients, but just a kind of what I think an easier process that you can make a quick at-home peanut butter cup syrup. So we have about 460 grams of water that we're going to be adding into our bowl. And next we're just going to add a little bit of Himalayan salt, just a couple cracks of salt in there. And again, salt just helps to bring out a lot of those flavors. I like to use this one. This one is a erythritol monk fruit sweetener blend, and it's 0 calorie because the erythritol doesn't get absorbed into your bloodstream. However, I have used these before as well, which is sucralose. It's Splenda with sweetened with sucralose. They say they're 0 calories, but they're not. Each packet is probably about 4 calories, and each pack weighs about 1 gram. Now this is much sweeter than this one here, so you would probably use half the amount of sweeteners. All right, so we're going to use roughly about 40 grams of our monk fruit erythritol sweetener. All right, next up we're just going to use some artificial vanilla extract. Vanilla just helps to complement the chocolate flavor, so we're going to use about 1 teaspoon of vanilla extract. Just to add a little bit more sweetness, again, we're just going to use some of these sweet drops. So I like to use probably about 1 teaspoon worth of combination between the regular sweet drops and the vanilla cream. We're just going to whisk all of these together until you see all of the sweetener and the salt just kind of dissolve, and all you're left with is liquid. And then we're going to get started by putting our dry ingredients in a separate bowl. There we go, and you'll see that most of the sweetener and the salt has pretty much dissolved, so we're just going to set that aside. And now we're just going to weigh out all of our dry ingredients in a smaller bowl, and then we're going to mix everything together. All right, for our first dry ingredient, we're going to be putting some PB2. This is our powdered peanut butter. We're going to use about 10 grams of our powdered peanut butter. Next up, we're just going to use some cocoa powder. So we're going to use 1 serving, which is about 6 grams. To help thicken it up, we're going to use some xanthan gum. And we're just going to use about 2 grams of xanthan gum, and we're going to put that in with our dry mixture. And our last dry ingredient is going to be using some of this chocolate jello pudding. Now, I know a lot of people are having problems finding this in your area, or for whatever reason you can't get it. So this just enhances the chocolate flavors, but it's also a thickening agent. So if you'd like, you can add a little bit more xanthan gum, or you can even add some cornstarch, which will also help with the thickening process. And to give it a little bit more chocolate flavor, you might have to add a little bit more cocoa powder, or you can even sub out and use some chocolate sweet drops. Anything else that's going to also enhance and give you a little bit more of that chocolate flavor, you can use as in combination instead of using the Jello pack. But we're going to use 5 grams of this Jello pudding. We're just going to use a fork and just mix all of our dry ingredients together to avoid any clumping. And that's it. We're ready to do our mixing, and we're going to mix our dry and our wet ingredients together. So while I'm stirring in my dry ingredients, I'm just going to kind of continue to agitate it. Once you get that syrup type consistency. So while you're kind of stirring and getting everything mixed in together, if you are going to be using a whisk, which I recommend because whisks help to grab air into the mixture, which is what activates the xanthan gum. It's the air mixing in that gives it that thicker consistency. And also storing it in the fridge will also help to thicken it up just a little bit as well. So just keep all those little things in mind. All right, so for me, this is a good consistency. You can see it does have a little more viscosity to it, and it's a little bit thicker than it just being obviously a water mixture. And you can even taste it at this point. If you want a little bit sweeter, you can add a little bit more sweetener and kind of just judge it this way at that point. So now we're gonna pour this into our jar and store it in the fridge for it to be ready for my pancakes for tomorrow. So there's about 110 calories in this entire container that weighs about 530 grams. That works out to about 10 calories per 60 gram serving. All right, any leftover that you have, you can always put it in a smaller container or a glass, store it in the fridge if you want, or finish that off. If you can fit it all in the jar, that's great as well. So that's ready to go. We're gonna store that in the fridge. It will thicken up a little bit while it's in the fridge. Just as delicious as I remember them. Should probably see if anything got altered with this whole space-time continuum thing. Seems pretty legit. Maybe I should check my YouTube channel. What? Whoa, that's heavy. Space-time continuum worked out better for me.